You are listening to Resolving Reality Radio, www.resolvingreality.com. Welcome to Resolving Reality Radio. This is your host, Emmett, the creator of the website www.resolvingreality.com. Resolving Reality is an independent Irish media platform that features opinions and topics not covered in the mainstream media, including the alternative, the politically incorrect, the undiscovered and the ignored. You can find Resolving Reality on Facebook, YouTube and SoundCloud, and you can follow Resolving Reality on Twitter @ResolvingOr, both capital Rs. You can find links to those profiles on our website, resolvingreality.com. The icons are at the bottom of each page. Please like, follow, share and subscribe. In this episode, I'm speaking to David Walsh, who is a chairman, spokesman and one of the co-founders of an organisation called Men's Voices Ireland. Their website is www.mensvoicesireland.com. You can find them on Facebook and YouTube, Men's Voices Ireland. Follow them on Twitter @mensvoicesIRL. That's a capital M, V and IRL in caps too. The email contact is mensvoicesireland@gmail.com. And you can find all those links up on their website, mensvoicesireland.com. In this interview, we'll be discussing many of the topics and issues involving men today, including domestic abuse, the education system, family law, suicide, false rape allegations, and radical feminism. Stay tuned to Resolving Reality Radio. Hi David, welcome to Resolving Reality Radio, and thanks for being here.
Thank you very much, Emmett. Glad to be here.
Now, you are the founder and spokesman for an organisation called Men's Voices Ireland. And listeners, please visit their website, mensvoicesireland.com. So what is Men's Voices Ireland all about, and why did you set up this organisation?
Well, first of all, just to be absolutely clear, I'm one of the founding members. There were four of us altogether who set it up back in late 2015. But to get back to your question, Men's Voices Ireland is a male advocacy group. It was set up because of the glaring absence of any male advocacy group acting on with a broad brief in this country in relation to issues of concern to men and boys. There was simply no such group in existence. And we saw the need for setting up a male advocacy group which would campaign on a whole range of issues which were of concern to men and boys and which were receiving no attention at all, politically or within the media or elsewhere or otherwise.
It's really interesting because, you would think that there's so much political emphasis put on women's issues, and we'll come to this later, that people often forget that there's men in Ireland as well, and there's a lot of ongoing issues that affect men's lives which aren't really been focused on. So you kind of acknowledge that there was a certain imbalance there, if you will.
Exactly. It's not just a certain imbalance. It's a large and it's a growing imbalance, Emmett. In fact, it's growing rapidly. I mean, there is an enormous campaign that's going on now, a program which is being put together, a program to advance women's issues, but it's at the expense of men in large measure. And this program is far advanced. It's receiving no attention whatsoever from the media. It's in broad daylight. It's open, with an open view to everybody, but it's receiving no attention. And men's issues are receiving no attention whatsoever. And men are being disadvantaged at a high rate, I would say.
And that obviously affects the whole of society. If you have a big chunk of the population like that are being completely neglected, and you have another side prioritised instead.
Exactly. You have 50% of the population which is utterly sidelined, ignored. Its issues are simply not even treated within the media. And you have the other 50% who's actively engaged in advancing its own programme, which has a great deal of media clout because the media are 98% in favour of it. They have well-advanced groups, well-supported, well-funded advocacy groups of their own to advocate and to put forward and to progress their agenda, like the National Women's Council, with many others as well. And they are doing this at a great rate. And the politicians are simply acquiescing in everything that they demand. And they are making demands all the time and making new ones every week. And this is going ahead without even a murmur from the media or the commentators generally.
Wow, that's
I mean, there's a large climate now, I would say, of fear on the part of a great many people, fear of speaking up, fear of speaking up on behalf of men, fear of being seen to be out of step in some way with some great ideological advancement. And the result is that men's issues are falling by the wayside, they're being neglected. And it's happening, and it's increasingly happening, and it's getting worse all the time. But we can talk about the different issues as we go along.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. We'll get into plenty of detail for each one. Can you tell me when you set up the organisation and about the changes you've noticed since then to now, basically?
Well, I became aware of a certain imbalance, a worrying imbalance, many, many years ago, 25 to 30 years ago. And it began with the figures on suicide. And like a number of other people, I was seeing figures for male suicide, which were growing in relation to suicide for women. Male-female ratio was growing. And there seemed to be little or nothing being done about it. There was very little discussion about it. There was no attempt to investigate what was happening. The other major issue that I was reading about this because one or two concerned journalists were writing about this mostly. The family law courts and the way men were suffering in relation to decisions made in the family law courts, particularly in relation to children, how they were being separated from children and how they were struggling to get access to children and often being denied access to children and how they were being removed from their homes. And the law seemed to be totally on one side and impervious to any challenge. So that was one of the background for me. But I then became connected with a few other men who were similarly concerned and who thought like I did and who were seeing the same things and who were observing things from maybe slightly different perspectives than I was. And they were seeing more disadvantage. And we were talking about this for 2 or 3 years leading up to 2015. But then in the autumn of 2015, we decided there's no use in 4 or 5 of us sitting down here around the table talking about it. We need to do something about it. So it was in that way that Men's Voices was born. There was a meeting held in Maynooth in December of that year. It was decided to set up Men's Voices. The thing that really propelled us along at that stage was that there was a general election coming up in February of 2016. And we decided that it would be a really good idea and a good opportunity to actually highlight men's issues during that election. And we would try to canvass support from all candidates in that election. That's what we tried to do.
So there was definitely a bunch of, well, certainly in your case personally, there was definitely a bunch of kind of catalysts. Like there were certain things happening and imbalances that were emerging that you kind of have that moment where you go, hang on a minute, this is a bit unusual, like where the men's suicide rates being really kind of, there's a 4-to-1 ratio, I believe, for many years there. It's like, it's moments like that makes people take notice and go, hang on a sec, something isn't right here.
Something isn't right here. And we kept reading in the paper and in the media and kept hearing in the media constantly more demands from women's organizations for more advancement for women. The National Women's Council were constantly in the media looking for more concessions on women's issues. And you had other women's organizations like Women's Aid, Rape Crisis Centres and Rape Crisis Network and so on. These were constantly being highlighted. These issues are constantly being highlighted in the media, but there wasn't a word about the way that these issues affected men. Not a word. That was why we decided to set up a male advocacy group. We noticed that the National Women's Council was state funded. It has been state funded, incidentally, since 1972. It is very well organized. It's got something like 11 full-time staff. So it's constantly at work lobbying politicians. It's constantly at work lobbying and taking part in Dáil committees. Every time that there's a new piece of legislation being put up for enactment, it is first debated within Dáil committees and Oireachtas committees, I should say. Interested parties will make submissions before those committees, whether it be on health or whether it be on education or on family law, whatever. And we constantly saw that there were many groups acting on behalf of women, but there was not a single one acting on behalf of men.
As you described there's a bit of a network, almost a whole structure set up to be concerned about women's rights and women's issues, but not so much for men. Have you had much interaction with other men's groups, and who would you say are the more prominent ones that are, making an impact somehow?
It's easy to answer that. I mean, there are very, very few men's groups which are effective in any way, in the way that we think that they should be. For instance, there's the Fathers for Justice is one group that we have had good contact with. But apart from that, I just can't think of any other group which is actually making headlines and attempting to do something about the current imbalance and the current disadvantages that are affecting men and boys.
It's incredible because, we'll get into the suicide statistics in a little bit, but because of all the different issues that are affecting Ireland, suicide is obviously, you can't get much more dramatic and serious than that when you have a section of the population literally terminating their own lives because they're not being cared for or looked after somehow. And there's no political will or any drive to be willing to solve that problem when it's so serious as, suicide. It's incredible. But will we get into domestic abuse first or domestic violence first? I'm looking forward to hearing your take on a lot of things. So domestic abuse is like something that people always consider it as being one way, that there's never male victims of domestic abuse. And it's as cut and dried as women are the victims, men are the abusers. Would you say that's a fair assessment of how this is perceived?
Yes, unfortunately, that's the way it's assessed. That's the way it's perceived by the vast majority of the media and by politicians as well. It's seen as a one-way perpetration, that men are the perpetrators and women are invariably the victims. And this is one enormous area in which the imbalance with regard to media attention is so profound and has such enormous effects, because it's so difficult to get the message out there that men are actually have a case in relation to domestic violence, that women are also capable of domestic violence. But it's almost impossible to get the media to hear this message. They won't actually listen. It's quite extraordinary. We have made enormous efforts with mainstream media, press, radio, TV, and we have invariably been fobbed off at every stage, try to put forward this message. It's disbelieved. It's not entertained at all. The stranglehold that groups like Women's Aid have on this issue is just enormous. It's just almost impossible to budget. It's a hugely controversial area, of course. That's one issue about it. It arouses strong emotions, and
absolutely, yeah.
It's understandable for that reason that people are wary of getting into debate about it. It's so contentious. But nevertheless, we have to look at this in a dispassionate way. We have to look at the evidence in an impartial manner. And actually, the overwhelming majority of the evidence shows that domestic violence is committed by both men and women at comparable rates, and men and women are victims at comparable rates. This is an issue which is never entertained by the media. They just run in horror. I mean, I've talked to dozens of journalists about these issues, trying to get this across. They run in terror from discussing this matter.
That's incredible. That surprises me because we know how the media, especially nowadays, that in general, they seem to love really sensational material. And you would think that their ears would prick up when you start telling them that this isn't even. There's cases of male domestic abuse. You think they'd be interested because it's dramatic by nature, but they don't seem to be, which is fascinating.
You have to understand that the women's groups have been very, very active for the last 50 years. And this is international level. This is not just happening in Ireland, but radical feminism has organized itself in a very, very powerful way over the last 50 years. It's been done very systematically, in a very organized way. And it has gained enormous influence, in particular over the media. This is one section, an institution in society in which it has made enormous efforts to gain influence and control. And this is a major part of the reason why you're not hearing about it in the media, is because the control that radical feminism has over the media, in particular on issues such as domestic violence and on false accusations and so on.
And because, of course, this is bigger picture stuff. I don't want to knock you off track here, but because of the media, it really influences people's perception of reality. And, unless people are willing to actually separate from the system and look at the statistics separately and not be influenced by anyone with an agenda, it's really hard to see the truth, isn't it? You've got all these influences pushing people's minds in one direction, kind of.
That's exactly right. Yes. In actual fact, I have experience of several journalists who told me quite fairly that they don't want to talk about domestic violence or issues concerned with it because they're frightened.
Wow.
That's a sad fact. Let me get back to some facts about domestic violence.
Yeah.
In 2005, there was a report done called the NCC report. It's the most influential report on domestic violence and the most comprehensive one done in Ireland. But that's well over 12 years ago now. But It found that underreporting by men was a major issue. Underreporting by men. And it found that only 5% of male victims of severe violence report to the Gardaí. Only 5%. Whereas 29% of female victims report to the Gardaí. Now, that's a startling figure to start with. Now, if you take some international reports on domestic violence, and I'll start with a report called the PASK report, PASK, which stands for Partner Abuse State of Knowledge. It was published in 2013 in the journal Partner Abuse. It's an unparalleled 3-year research project It was conducted by 42 scholars at 20 universities and research centres. It includes some of the foremost names in the whole area of domestic violence. And I will read you some of the report's findings. Its findings are that men and women perpetrate physical and non-physical forms of abuse at comparable rates. Most domestic violence is mutual. In other words, both people, both male and female, are engaged in the violence. And the past report reckons that well over 50% of domestic violence is mutual. It finds that women are as controlling as men, that domestic violence by men and women is correlated with essentially the same risk factors, and it finds that male and female perpetrators are motivated for similar reasons.
Interesting. It's about personalities almost rather than what sex they are.
Yes, they act in very similar ways. It's nothing to do with the patriarchy. The prevailing view, which is propagated by groups like Women's Aid, Safe Island, and so on, is that male violence against women is based on patriarchy and on controlling women. Men use violence to exert control over women. But the past report refutes that. It refutes that entirely because it says both male and female perpetrators are motivated for similar reasons. I could give you dozens of other reports with similar findings. In fact, most of the recent reports all corroborate one another. Let me quote to you the support services for male and female victims before I forget it, because this is very, very relevant. For women, there's Women's Aid. It's a very large organisation. It has a 24/7 helpline. It has something like 20 refuges for women. Safe Island actually is the organisation that runs the refuge centres. And they, as I say, they operate on a 24/7 basis. Contrast that with the situation for male victims. You have one small organisation called Amen, which operates out of a provincial town, Navan. It does not have full-time centres in any of the major cities. Dublin doesn't have a full-time centre. Amen operates a 9-to-5 service on weekdays, Monday to Friday. It doesn't operate on weekends. That's a stark contrast. Couple that with the fact that there are absolutely no refuges for men, none. And couple that with the fact that Amen is based essentially in a provincial town. What are people to do in the rest of Ireland, outside of Navan, outside of Leinster, in Dublin, Cork, Limerick, Galway, and so on? What are they to do? What are men to do who are suffering domestic violence in these places? Essentially, they have little or no supports. Now, I'll give you the actual figures for the amount spent on the services for men and women. In 2017, this is the most recent figure. In 2017, the figure from funding for male services out of the total provided for domestic violence services was 1.4%. 1.4% was the amount spent on male services for victims of domestic violence. Unbelievable. That is appalling. And have you heard about that in the media? No. Has anybody in politics spoken up about this? No, they won't do it. And this is a glaring omission. It's a glaring reality, and it's an indictment of both the media and the political system that this kind of thing is allowed to go on.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting because as we know with politicians, they're either pushing agendas or they often just do what's popular and what's fashionable to kind of further their own careers, et cetera, et cetera. And they don't actually really solve problems anyway. So if you have a massive academic push or movements to kind of convince everyone in society that there's a patriarchy, men oppress women, and that's the end of it, well, then the politicians will just, operate in tune to that. And they were not interested in men's issues or men's well-being at all because it doesn't suit the current kind of paradigm, if you will.
That's exactly right. Yes, that's exactly it. Politicians respond to pressure groups. The women's pressure groups like the Women's Aid, the National Women's Council, Safe Ireland, the Rape Crisis Centres, there's all of these, and these all have subgroups as well in operation. It's a massive, massive organisation, and they have enormous, enormous political clout, and the politicians respond to that. All the political parties uniformly will act in the same way. They won't say anything that might offend these powerful lobby groups, and that's the problem.
Yeah, it's not about empathy or kind of ethics at all. It's about political movements and the pop culture and stuff. looking into this, prepping for the interview a little bit, I looked into some of the different things that's happening, and it kind of dawned on me about the European Union, because you have this political entity that's Europe-wide. So you had national laws, now we've got European laws. So you got more and more people involved, more politics and more legislation and all that stuff. And then we had the Istanbul Convention. Now, I know a little bit about it, but please expand on it for me. And I'll just give the background for the listeners. It was opened for signature by member states on the 11th of May 2011. It was signed by 32 countries, including Turkey, between 2012-2018. And as of January this year, it's been signed by 46 countries and the European Union itself. And it came into force 4 years ago. So can you tell us what effect this has had on Ireland, if any at all?
I mean, the Istanbul Convention is a glaring reminder of just how powerful the pressure groups have infiltrated even international organizations like the Council of Europe. The Council of Europe is, get this, it's a human rights organization. It consists of something like 47 states, and it promotes and has promoted and has drawn up this Istanbul Convention. Like you say, it was published in 2011, and it is called for, it has got many, many states to ratify it up to now. But it is informed, there is no other way to describe it. It's utterly and completely informed by radical feminist ideology.
Right.
I will give you 2 quotes from the preamble, which will, I think, illustrate what I'm saying. The first quote from the preamble is this: recognizing the structural nature of violence against women as gender-based violence, and that violence against women is one of the crucial social mechanisms by which women are forced into a subordinate position compared with men. That's the first quote. You will see that it is informed by ideology because the evidence contradicts it many times over. It says violence against women is one of the crucial social mechanisms by which women are forced into a subordinate position compared with men. So men use violence to subjugate women. You will also notice that it talks about gender-based violence. This is another key phrase that the feminists constantly use. It has never been discussed, talked about, but they use it as a weapon as well. That's one key phrase from the Istanbul Convention. But the Istanbul Convention contains a whole lot of articles, something like 80 in all. And many of them are utterly discriminatory. And I will give you an example to show how discriminatory they can be. Article 4.4 was put in there to anticipate any possible objections. And it says the following: special measures to protect women from gender-based violence shall not be considered discrimination under the Convention.
Okay, I get what they're doing there, yeah.
So you see, this is a self-validating decree.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's self-validating. It's designed to immediately to push away any challenge whatsoever, to sideline any challenge.
Yeah. They're covering their backs straight away.
It says that whatever preferential treatment the Convention accords to women must not be or will not be considered as discrimination. It's extraordinary. I've never seen anything like it in a document, in any kind of a document, but in particular a document coming from a so-called human rights group.
There's an inherent double standard there. It's like the subtext of what they're saying is this: we're doing this because we're humanitarian, we care about women's rights. But if you oppose this, you're incorrect, and you don't have the right to apply this fake humanitarian thing to any other groups and societies like men. So there's a bit of a hypocrisy in how they operate.
It's complete hypocrisy. It's utterly complete hypocrisy. And it makes a whole lot of other acts, there are a whole lot of other articles which provide for resources to be applied to women's groups. For instance, here's Article 9. Mm-hmm. Parties shall recognise, encourage and support at all levels the work of relevant NGOs and of civil society active in combating violence against women and establish effective cooperation with these organisations. Notice that it says nothing about organisations combating violence against men. It's quite extraordinary. It's overtly discriminatory. It excludes male victims and men's groups, and it provides that more resources, more funding shall be channeled into those groups which are already well funded already, providing for female victims of domestic violence.
Well, they're just cementing the whole men are the oppressors and women are the oppressed narrative that they've been pushing with pieces of legislation and law like that. They just cement it and try to cement any sort of dissent as well. It flies in the face of what you mentioned there about, I think it was PASC, you said 2005, when they did the survey on domestic violence, and whether it's men or women, and you said it's kind of even keeled. So the stats say that it's more about personalities than their gender. But what they're saying is that it's a gender-based violence tells you basically, look, men are the oppressors and perpetrators, and that's it.
Exactly. You put your finger on it there. Domestic violence is not gender-based. It's neutral. It's not gender-based at all. But they have written into the description of domestic violence, they've written in it's gender-based. That it's violence against women, it's gender-based. And the repetition of these phrases is maintained right throughout the Istanbul Convention, dozens and dozens of times, to hammer home the idea that violence against women is a major thing and that it's prevalent throughout society and that it's gender-based as well.
Brainwashing almost.
Brainwashing, yes, exactly. And to give you an idea of just how effective the groups have been in preventing any discussion of this, you would imagine that an international convention of this magnitude with such far-reaching consequences down the line would be discussed in the media, would be discussed in press, on radio and in TV. But since 2011, it has never been discussed once, not once, in any major press articles. It has never been discussed on radio or TV, except, of course, when groups like Women's Aid are calling for it to be implemented. And they won't argue about it. There's never a debate about it. We have constantly challenged women's groups and other groups who support this to debate this with us, but they won't do it. Part of the reason they won't do it is because they can't do it, because it's indefensible. It's an utterly appalling document, draconian document. But the second part of it is, of course, that they have so much influence in the media, they don't need to. They don't have to do it. It's simply the way the system operates. The media doesn't require them to debate it. But I'll give you another instance of the hypocrisy behind all of this in relation to the fact that women don't commit domestic violence. If you look at studies of lesbian violence, for instance, and many studies of lesbian violence have been done, studies of lesbian violence invariably find that it is at least as severe as heterosexual violence and more frequent.
Wow, I didn't know that. Interesting.
Yes, and the past report says, nor is the incidence of domestic violence among lesbian cohorts minimal. In fact, abuse among lesbians occurs with far greater frequency than among heterosexuals, and far more frequently than male on female abuse.
Oh, wow. That's a big one. That's a big piece of information.
Can you imagine coming out and trying to defend the Istanbul Convention on the basis of being faced with that kind of charge?
There's no way they would acknowledge. You'll never hear that in public because it doesn't suit their agenda.
They won't do it. But as I say, they're not required to do it because the media doesn't pressure them to do it. The media just simply lets them off the hook all the time. And this is an appalling reality about censorship in Ireland in 2018. In the last few years, commentators in Ireland never ceased to look back at the 1940s and 50s and deplore what was going on at that time. They deplore the fact that certain women were disadvantaged at the time, that single mothers suffered discrimination. And they talk about the censorship of that time as well and the power of the church. But if you examine our own society right now, you will find that exactly the same thing is going on in reverse. It's now, except that now men are the victims. And
it's flipped around
completely. And there's nothing being said about it. The media have no interest in discussing it whatsoever. None.
That's really interesting because, we're talking about the humanitarian side of it. If you say you're a humanitarian person or an organization, surely you should know that, well, if someone says they're egalitarian or they believe in equality, then there shouldn't be these double standards. It should be a better society for everyone, but they don't seem to be following their own brief. It's almost like humanitarianism and compassion and all these words they use are just there as like a cover for the real agenda, which is about actually perhaps to speculate, to create an imbalance almost. The misandry problem we're starting to have where men are just demonized and they're considered the oppressors, and that's all there is to it, really. It's fascinating how it's kind of flipped around and done a 180 like that almost.
Exactly. That's exactly what we're seeing today is a systematic, sustained effort and program to demonize men and to reduce them to second or even third class status. This program is very well advanced and it's been enormously successful. And it's even subsidized by the state to make it even worse.
To make it even more obvious as well.
Exactly. The media is entirely complicit in the whole business, the whole enterprise.
Should we get into some more details about the particular issues affecting Irish men? What about the males in education point? I think that's quite interesting. Like from what I've heard about it, this kind of agenda, which is kind of prioritizing women over men, is starting to affect even young men. And we're starting to see that with the kids in school and in secondary school, where they're starting to lose interest and motivation. Is that a symptom of this whole thing, do you think? What's the statistics on this as well? And why do you think this is happening, that boys are starting to lose interest in school?
It's a very complex matter again. Like all of these issues are complex because they have ramifications going outside the education system and going outside schools and so on. And they enter into the relationships between men and women. And of course, boys are well aware of what's happening today. They hear about it in the media and they communicate among themselves what's going on. And they're very well aware of the fact that being male today is seen as some kind of disadvantage, as some kind of disorder. Being male is a disorder now.
There's something wrong with you inherently because of what you are, and they haven't even done anything with their lives or matured yet, and already they're being considered, they feel like they're considered a bad thing, or it's bad to be male.
I mean, this is exactly the thing. And it's being aided and abetted by the new programs that are coming in all the time. For instance, the new consent program, which is being introduced in schools now, aims to educate or to inform kids about consent. But it's really aimed at boys. I mean, boys are the ones who initiate any sexual advances between boys and girls. Boys are the ones who initiate these advances. So boys are seen to be the ones who are in the hot seat here. They're seen to be the ones who are, under suspicion, if you like, and they have to be told that you must seek consent for everything you do, and you must be absolutely sure that you are on track all the time. But that's just the latest manifestation of this program that is going on, this wide enterprise that is going on in relation to boys in school. But going back to boys in school in a wider sense for the moment, I make one remark at the outset. You know how we're constantly hearing about the need for girls to do STEM subjects, the need to more girls to get into STEM, meaning science, technology, engineering and mathematics. Lots of money has been spent on this program. We've even had a high-powered commission of university people and others investigating it and trying to get more girls to study the STEM subjects. But you never hear a word about the fact that boys are disadvantaged in a whole lot of ways and in far more serious ways. So, for instance, take the dropout rate for boys at secondary school. In 2010, the dropout rate for boys at secondary level was 50% higher than that for girls.
Wow.
Yeah.
50%.
If you take men and women aged between 35 and 34 with a third level qualification, in 2016, 55% of women had a third level qualification as compared with 43% of men. So again, there's a 12% gap there. The percentage of the university population that is male has fallen below 45% now. In fact, in Ireland, it's not as bad as it is in the US, because in the US, it's something like are hovering around the 40% mark. And in the UK, it's not much better. This means that in a whole lot of disciplines, females outnumber males by a large amount. So, for instance, disciplines like education is enormously imbalanced. It's about 75% female, 25% male. Health and health-related subjects, even more of an imbalance. It's about 80-20 there. If you look at veterinary science, there's an enormous imbalance. It's more than 80% female. Social studies and languages also have a large female preponderance. So in all these areas, and some of these areas, you see, are important from a social perspective, because if you take law and health-related and medicine and education, these are disciplines which, have a wide impact on society. And the people who are in these areas are able to influence policy and social policy to a very large extent. Law, health-related issues, education, of course.
Sociology and the mental sciences and stuff like that.
Psychology is particular imbalance there, about 75-25, if not more. And psychology is important for the point of view of drawing up mental health programs, deciding what policy will be in mental health. So if you have a huge preponderance of females in psychology, then they are automatically going to put forward policies which are far more adapted to the needs of females than they are the needs of males. And this is what's happening.
Right. Especially with the narrative that's happening in general, they're going to lean that way anyway, aren't they?
They are going to lean that way anyway. But it's the preponderance is made even worse by the numbers that I'm talking about. So that is the situation, the issues in education. Another issue is the feminization of education. If you look at primary teachers, 85% of primary teachers are female. And that has been steady roughly the same since 2003. If you look at secondary level, the percentage of male teachers has fallen precipitously from 40% in 2003 to under 32% in 2012. Now, that is a very rapid and serious decline.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Especially at secondary level, where boys probably need more attention. Boys are adolescents. They are growing into young men. They are adolescents. They have problems associated with adolescence. They are trying to negotiate their own masculinity and what it means to grow into manhood. And they have issues in all these areas. And they need male role models in these areas. But the overwhelming preponderance of teachers are female. So they don't understand them, even with the best will in the world. And I'm not trying to be critical here. With the best will in the world, they don't understand what is bothering these boys.
Yeah, exactly. Because they can't relate to them. They can only relate to them so far if they're not men.
That's exactly it. There was a document called Taking Boys Seriously. It was a report produced in 2012 by two people from Northern Ireland, two researchers. It's called Taking Boys Seriously. And it's a 5-year research project. And it came up with some very interesting findings. And it said that the barriers to learning are occurring at primary level. Boys are falling behind even at primary level and feeling that they cannot catch up. Basic literacy and numeracy skills are not being addressed. They're not being attended to early on in post-primary school. As a result, boys are getting bored easily, and allowing this to show itself in disruptive behaviour in the classroom, or simply turning off from the teacher. You were talking earlier about boys being turned off. This is exactly talking about that issue and explaining why.
Mm-hmm.
And the report says that the nature of teacher-pupil relationships is a primary factor in boys' motivation and attitudes towards learning. It's the most important issue affecting how boys will do in school and what expectations they have of doing well later in their exams and going forward into third level. This report is actually corroborated by other reports. For instance, a report from the OECD, 2 reports from the OECD back up what this report is saying. One study from 2014 called for more male teachers in schools because it says male teachers can serve as role models and contribute to students developing positive gender identities.
You touched on it earlier. If young men, especially, early teenagers, if they're in this system that's starting to neglect them and demonize them slightly, they don't have the maturity and the rationality to realize how it's affecting them. You know what I mean? But yet they're affected regardless. It's a tricky issue. It's hard to put your finger on it. But if there's a quantum attitude within the system, the total system is geared towards prioritizing girls and that they're being disadvantaged, that the boys are going to be affected whether they can articulate it or not, and it manifests in negative behaviour and bad grades, etc., etc.
Exactly. And in fact, a second OECD study called the ABC of Gender Equality in Education comes out with a startling finding. It says teachers give girls higher marks than boys of a similar ability.
Oh, wow. What was the reason for that?
The suggestion is girls are more likely to be better behaved in class. They're seen as being better at the subject. They are more school friendly. They incline to do more homework, and their results are marked up as a consequence.
So that's political. That's almost, that's discrimination, isn't it?
It is, yeah. It is. As one commentator, one of the few journalists who actually commentated on that OECD ABC report he said teachers are more likely to mark up girls, and that this leniency is an unacknowledged reward for being more school friendly and better behaved.
Wow.
So all that is inevitably going to result in boys doing less well in education because they're not being sufficiently well appreciated. They're not being seen as being respected. Boys' behaviour is seen as abnormal. The behaviour of girls is seen to be the norm. And boys' behaviour is judged in comparison with that. And it suffers by comparison with that. And this turns boys off as well. And therefore, the boys are more inclined to drop out of school. And they are much more likely now to spend long hours playing computer games rather than doing homework.
Because why would you bother if your work isn't being graded fairly? Let's face it, school can be difficult and difficult time for kids anyway. And if things aren't fair, they're not being treated correctly, it's that little push they need to just drop out and forget about the whole thing, kind of.
That's right, Jim. That is what is happening. And this is happening, as I say, across the Western world. It's happening in the US, it's happening in the UK. In fact, just probably to finish off on this issue, a comment from the chief executive of UCAS, which is to do with undergraduate admissions at university and college in the UK. This woman, the chief executive, Mary Connock-Cook, she said, the potential of young men is somehow being let down by the school system.
Right. So it's right there out in the open. Well, not in the open, sorry, but it's been acknowledged.
But you don't have any interest groups which are putting this before politicians and saying to the Minister for Education, listen, you've got to do something about this. This is serious. You've got to take action here. But nobody is doing that. That is the problem.
Yeah. Well, let's get into, the child custody and family law thing. I know a little bit about it. Apparently, it's a bit of an imbalanced situation. I know it's a tricky kind of subject, especially when couples separate and stuff like that. But what's really happening there? Could you give us kind of summary about what's going on here in terms of the balance?
One part of the problem in relation to family law and custody and the decisions of the courts is that these courts have been in camera for many, many years. And only a few years ago were journalists actually admitted to the family courts to report on what's happening. So we don't know a lot about what's going on in the family courts. The best source of information we have about the family courts is a remarkable thesis written by, I would say, a remarkable woman. Her name is Roisin O'Shea, Dr. Roisin O'Shea, and she published this thesis in 2013. The title is Judicial Separation and Divorce in the Circuit Court. It's a very comprehensive piece of work. She spent a long time in the family courts. She heard about 1,200 relevant cases. She heard all circuit courts across all 8 circuits. She heard about 187 case reports. This is comprehensive. This is the point that I'm making here. I'll give you some of her findings. She says that 96% of children are in the primary care of mothers, and where access was persistently and unilaterally withheld by the primary carer, no sanction was imposed by the court.
Okay.
This is a problem. I'll say a little more about that in a short while, about the denial of access. Another thing she pointed out was that in judgments made in the family court, men rarely acquired the right to reside in the family home. Only in 13% of cases did men acquire the right to reside in the family home.
Oh, really? So they're being forced out of their homes?
That's right. The Family Law Act of 1995 provides for separation, whereby the court can decide that where there is breakdown in a relationship, it can provide for the removal of one member from the family home for the lifetime or for a set period. And invariably, that is the man. This also applies in the cases where the man had sole responsibility for discharging the mortgage on the family home. So the man is not only removed from the home, but he also may have to pay the mortgage or a contribution to the mortgage as well.
Oh my God.
As well as providing accommodation for himself now that he's been turfed out.
I know that homelessness is one of the issues to talk about on your website. We won't get into that because it's been done to death, but doesn't that connect with what you just said? If you've got a situation where men are being, in those certain cases, are being forced out, you're potentially adding to another big problem society has, which is homelessness. And men are mostly the ones who are on the streets.
These issues are connected. I mean, the issues we were talking about are connected. The decisions made in the family law courts removing men from their home is connected with the homelessness problem, the fact that men fall into homelessness. And it's also connected with the suicide figures as well.
Exactly. Yeah. There's a little link here. There's these like ripple effects that affect different areas of society. When you've got an injustice in one area, it creates problems in another area and so on.
Everything in life is connected in some way, and particularly in social life and social affairs. These issues are closely connected. The fact that the family courts favour women is borne out by the applicants for separation. 75% of applications for separation when there are children involved are made by women, 75%. So that bears out the fact that women know that they will get a favourable outcome in the family courts.
You wouldn't get it the other way around. If men know the system is rigged against them, you wouldn't try to initiate something like that, unless you want to lose everything potentially. Yeah.
Roisin O'Shea found further that if you looked at genuine 50-50 parenting arrangements where there is a breakdown in the relationship and where 50-50 parenting arrangements are, would be the requirement of equality, treatment of people in equal ways. She said that only 1% of cases, only 1% of children resided under 50-50 parenting arrangements.
Wow.
Roisin O'Shea actually, it doesn't mince her words. I mean, she goes on to say another factor in connection with the family court system is that it often happens that in bitter disputes, especially where children are involved, allegations of sexual abuse can be made against one partner by the other. And it's overwhelmingly the case that in such cases of allegations of sexual abuse, they're made by the woman against the man. And she quotes one judge that she notes in her work, who said, "I am concerned that allegations of sexual abuse are at times being used as a very effective weapon, but a court is obliged to ensure that the HSE or the Gardaí investigate all such complaints."
Right. So people know when you accuse someone of doing that in that situation, they know that it has a certain power to kind of put the state into motion. The ears will prick up and things will happen for you if you make an allegation like that in certain situations.
Exactly, because in all cases, the police are obliged to investigate. The HSE and the police are obliged to investigate every allegation that's made against children, abuse against children.
And will we get into the false rape allegations thing? Because this is like a bit of more of a sensational topic. Well, they're all equally important, of course, but we were talking in our correspondence about the review that was done of cases in England and Wales. It was last January, I think it was. About 600 cases are being reviewed because, again, perhaps because of the political climate, that accusing people of rape can be an effective weapon to kind of get back at someone or go after someone for a particular reason.
When we initially decided to make false allegations one of the 6 issues which we would look at, we had at the time very, very little evidence, because there's very, very little evidence available in this country of such cases, because TUSLA was only established in 2014. And it is already under fire in a number of ways, as you know, for several reasons. And one of them was the botched job they did on the investigation on Maurice McCabe.
Yeah, absolutely.
Of course, there are other allegations. There are other cases as well about adoption cases. They're mired in controversy. So that the calls that people have made, including ourselves, to TUSLA to look at other possible accusations against men following on the uncovering of the false allegation against Sergeant McCabe. TUSLA simply said that they haven't got the resources to investigate this. So we don't know actually how many are there in the pipeline, how many are in the background. I'll get on to the case in England, because this is extraordinary. There were a number of high-profile rape cases in England leading up to the end of last year, and it was discovered that they were all based on false accusations. There were quite a number of them, and they were based on false accusations. And the evidence which uncovered the false accusation was not produced until the last minute, disclosed to the defence until the last minute.
That's incredible.
It is incredible, yeah. Requests from the defence lawyers for CCTV footage were ignored or cherry-picked when it did arrive. Text messages supporting the defence case did not come to light until the last minute or were heavily redacted. One young man who worked in Parliament spent 14 months in the full glare of the tabloid press. In his case, the tabloid press was tipped off by the complainant hours after the alleged assault. These cases were uncovered because text messages or CCTV footage or computer records disclosed only at the last minute, or actually discovered quite by chance by the defence itself.
Yeah.
Showed that their lies were being told here. Their lies were being made and false accusations were being made.
So they didn't even know themselves till almost the last minute.
That's right. The men themselves, they didn't know until the last minute that this evidence actually existed, but was being withheld by the CPS, that is the Crown Prosecution Service in the UK. It was being withheld. It's also interesting.
So they're looking after them and they didn't produce the evidence. Interesting.
Yeah. It's also very, very significant that the head of the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service, in the last 5 years is a woman called Alison Saunders, who is a very controversial figure, who promoted a focus on female victims. And Saunders made headline news back last October 2017, when the CPS reported that the rape figures for 2016 were more than double the true figure.
How did that happen?
And how did this deception come to light? The deception only came to light when a letter from the UK Stats Office pointed out the true figure.
Oh my God, that's huge.
It's enormous.
And, like you said earlier, especially in cases where the evidence is kind of discovered later in a court case, what people don't realise is when someone's accused of rape and they haven't raped someone, their life is dragged through the mud. Their careers can be ruined, their family life is ruined. Men have even killed themselves because of stuff like this.
Yes, they've committed suicide. Some men have.
Yeah. And it's a very, very damaging thing. And we won't get into the Belfast rape trial thing because I'm not so interested in that. But the reaction afterwards, even when men are acquitted of rape, they're still considered guilty in a way. I know the UK system is different to here, and there's different dynamics going on here, but there seems to be a lack of acknowledgement that if a man is accused of rape and he hasn't done it, it's a very, very damaging thing, especially when the case goes so far and it's not till the end that they find out that there's no merit to the whole process.
Exactly. And again, this is yet another instance where the lack of male advocacy groups play such a crucial role that these kind of gross injustices are allowed to continue. And men's lives are allowed to be ruined, utterly ruined, because of a justice system which is out of control, essentially, gone out of control. In relation to the discovery of these false accusations, last January, as a response to that, the CPS announced that every rape and sexual assault case was now being reviewed. And to my knowledge, it's 600 cases have been or are being reviewed at the moment. But I don't know much more about it than that.
Yeah, we'll have to wait and see probably about, the details and stuff.
It's an enormous number. It's an utterly enormous number. Another tidbit in connection with that was that following the disclosure of these false accusations and the announcement about the review of such cases, a further announcement was made by a person within the CPS that the Metropolitan Police were now being told not to believe everything that a complainant tells them. Up to now, the insinuation is that they'd been told to believe everything that a complainant said about a sexual assault. And now they're being told, no, you don't need to believe it anymore. You have to carry out an impartial investigation. And these are the wheels of justice, if you don't mind.
This is the system that's supposed to be designed to give people on both sides, the plaintiff and the defendant, a fair trial. And if you have the Crown Prosecution Service, people withholding evidence and things like that as a matter of course, then they have to wheel around and say, look, don't trust everything that your client says. It becomes a bit of a farce at that point.
Yeah, and just to emphasize the seriousness of the whole thing and the way the barristers are taking it, a woman, Angela Rafferty, who is the chairman of the Criminal Bar Association, she warned that the police and the CPS may show unconscious bias in cases of sexual assault.
Combining that fact with the other thing we were talking about of the impact even an accusation has on someone you have, again, here's another area where the overall effect on men who aren't guilty of rape is extremely damaging, and it's a weaponized thing, accusing someone of rape when they haven't done it. And of course, there are genuine rapes out there, but we're not exactly talking about that. Those cases kind of speak for themselves. But, what we're kind of focusing on here is an innocent man being convicted of rape, which is different. And in those situations, a man doesn't deserve to have his life and career destroyed. And it's the system's job to protect a man in that situation from unlawful accusations.
Exactly. Yeah. The average sentence for conviction of rape in the Republic is 10 years. It can be a lot more, but the average is 10 years. So if you compare that with the way false accusations were treated, up until the last year or two, false accusations were simply dismissed almost. The women were simply cautioned, They just got a knuckles wrapped by the judge. They weren't jailed. There was no jail sentence imposed.
So it's a low risk endeavour on the woman's part. As well as that, I've heard of some cases where there's a few cases in the UK where a woman was accusing people of rape. It was a false allegation when she'd previously done the same thing, and they still listened to her. And only at the end, when the man could provide an alibi, at the end of the situation, did she stop lying. So, it's incredible that if the system hadn't caught her from lying, basically, she would have kept going and would have been happy to see that man be jailed when he didn't do anything.
Exactly. And in Ireland, I believe it's the case that the previous history of the accused can be produced in evidence in the court, but the previous history of the accuser may not be produced in court. That's as I understand it. Again, there's an enormous imbalance here because it could be extraordinarily important if a woman had previously made false allegations of rape, that be disclosed to the court.
Yeah, it should be, yeah.
Of course it should, yeah, of course.
Just to check that she's not crazy or she's an open man-hater. And again, like you're saying, it's the It's little details like that, and the whole system follows that, but the kind of logic goes out the window. And then when you don't have logic, you can't really have fairness of trial then.
That's exactly right, yeah. If you look at what has happened in the US, it's even more serious. There have been talk for a long time about a so-called rape culture, particularly on US campuses, university campuses. It was so prevalent and so influential that actually the Obama White House repeated the allegations made by the feminist groups, by the radical feminists. And depending on which group made the report, the allegation was that either 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 women at university campus would be sexually assaulted during their 4 years on campus. And this was repeated by the Obama White House. This turns out to be utterly false, completely and utterly false. It has been refuted many times, but it still keeps coming back, you know. It's extraordinarily difficult to kill these lies, utter lies, and that's what they are.
That's part of the overall problem I think we're dealing with here that causes all these issues, that people are just willing to believe what they're told, especially the authorities in the media and what they learn in academia and all these groups. They believe what they're told, especially when someone starts spouting details, you know, and facts and figures. People presume they're automatically telling the truth, that there's some legitimate research behind it. So we're dealing with spin, basically. It's kind of like political spin, but on particular issues and targeted towards men in favor of women, if you know what I mean. It's just information that people absorb as truth.
Yes. But unfortunately, unlike many political issues which are, you know, the subject of spin, this has enormous impacts on people's lives. This is about false accusations of the most serious crime, and one of the most serious crimes anybody could be accused of, and that is rape or serious sexual assault. And the fact that false allegations are going around in this way, it takes your breath away. It's extraordinary. But I wanted just to mention one or two things I came across recently in connection with rape in the US. They're having attempts to put a figure on it, but it's very, very difficult to put a figure on the number of false accusations. Incidentally, the radical feminists maintain that the percentage of false allegations is 2% at the most.
Okay, 2%,
that is completely wrong.
We can't trust them, obviously, so they're not going to admit it even if it was much higher.
They're not going to admit it even if it's true, you know, not at all.
Yeah.
A number of books and articles have been written about this, actually in the last 20 years. I mean, some of these articles are not recent at all. Some of them are more than 20 years old, but they haven't made headlines anywhere. And this again shows you the extent to which the media fails to report substantial issues in relation to crimes committed against men where women are involved. There was a book written by Stuart Taylor and Casey Johnson, and the title was Until Proven Innocent. And the subtitle is Political Correctness and the Shameful Injustices of the Duke Lacrosse Rape Case. Now, the title is actually very significant, Until Proven Innocent. So what it's saying is that when you were charged, as a male, when you were charged, particularly on campus, with a charge of sexual assault, you have to prove you are innocent. You are assumed to be guilty. That is the state of affairs. That is the way the political justice system has been politicized at the moment. That is how far it's gone.
It's criminal in itself. There's no fair trial.
No. In fact, the Duke Lacrosse rape case was one of the most serious ones. In fact, it was known by the public prosecutor that the 3 men concerned were actually innocent. He had irrefutable evidence that they were innocent, but he still persisted with the trial and an attempt to jail these men. They could have served up to 30 years in jail. And he still persisted with until it was shown by irrefutable evidence from different sources, witness that this woman was persistently lying. Incidentally, in that book, Until Proven Innocent, I believe Taylor and Johnson have said that they believe the figure for false accusations is at least 9%, but it's likely to be much higher. And they say that it's likely to be closer to 50%, if you don't mind.
Oh, my God.
Which is extraordinary.
I just thought a general point on this, because this issue, like we said, ties into other issues. It's like, okay, there is a problem with rape. Certain men rape, okay? Now, that's all we know for sure. After that, it gets a bit tricky. But like we were talking about earlier, it's not because men don't rape because they're men. They rape because there's something wrong with these people, you know? Like a man who rapes a woman, that's a personality thing. You know, that guy has got mental problems or whatever issues he's got going on where he thinks he has to do that because he's a dominant psychopathic type or sociopath or whatever. And that's the reason why he's a rapist. But the feminists will tell you the reason why he's a rapist is because he's a man. And that's part of the male psyche somewhere in the background is to be dominant, to be masculine and all that stuff. So they're distorting the facts, The rape culture, that meme, I was away for years and I came back and I really noticed the changes happening here. And I heard these young women repeating these catchphrases like rape culture. And I'm like, hang on a minute. That's actually a very sexist term, because when you say rape culture, you're implying that there's a culture of rape. You're implying that rape is something that, you're implying that men are doing it and that it seems to be a very male-like thing to do. But when we look at the statistics of how many rapes happen versus how many rapists men we have compared to how many men we have, you're talking about a really small percentage of the population. Yet it's blown out of proportion, and that feminism is trying to blanket term men. Raping women is just something that men do. It's not balanced at all.
Exactly. It's completely wrong. I mean, the allegation is it's an attempt that radical feminism does, which it applies to a whole range of issues. It attempts to whip up a kind of a hysteria, a frenzy around issues like rape. And the allegation is that men are culturally indoctrinated to rape or whatever, that it's some kind of way they're raised, or culturally indoctrinated to rape. In relation to rape and false allegations of rape in the US, I mean, I come across a number of prosecutors who have actually come out with broadly similar statements. One of them, Craig Silverman, a Colorado prosecutor, said the following. He said, any honest sexual assault investigator will tell you that rape is one of the most falsely reported crimes. Much the same is said by Linda Fairstein, former head of sex crimes unit at the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, who estimates half of all rape reports are unfounded. A half. This is extraordinary stuff.
This is from figures involved with that sort of, like that area of life.
You have people who are engaged with prosecuting those who are charged with rape. Yes, exactly. And yet another, just one more, a Purdue University sociologist, Eugene Canyon, he found that over a 9-year period, that 41% of rapes were officially declared false. That is, by the complainant's own admission, no rape had occurred.
Oh my God.
And this is reported in a paper he wrote in the Archives of Sexual Behavior, a journal, back in 1994. Again, this is 25 years ago, So this is not new. This has been there for all that length of time. But nobody has bothered to bring this forward, put this into the public domain, bring this into the news. And this again shows you how the news has been distorted, deliberately and systematically distorted in these cases.
The information is there. It's just not being diffused into the population, the public consciousness.
The information is there. The information is there coming from first-hand sources, people who are at the front line of investigations of these issues. They are reporting it, they are writing about it, and they are not being reported in the media. That is the appalling reality.
Will we move into the last item? Because I know we've kind of brought it up a few times, but it really is the elephant in the room, and we kind of should address it a little bit before we close up. The new feminist thing, right? So we could call it neo-feminism or radical feminism, and which is obviously kicking off here in Ireland in a big way. Now, just a little disclaimer before we start. Of course, I personally think, of course, there's plenty of merits to classical feminism, to giving rights to women that men have had and all this stuff. But this new wave stuff seems to be, like we were talking about earlier, is kind of made the country swing from one direction way in the opposite extreme, as almost like an overreaction. So how do you think this new wave feminism has affected people today? We've talked about like the demonization of young men and stuff like that, but say, what big changes have you noticed in the last few decades with this feminism thing, and when did you notice it was kicking off?
Well, it's been going on for a very long time, but in more recent years, it has become much more open and much more frontline, and it doesn't bother to try to conceal itself anymore. It's very open, and it doesn't care. It's a measure of its confidence. It's a measure of the growing confidence that these people have, that they will get whatever they want, and that they won't be held to account for the demands they make and for whatever they say, for the distortions they put about and so on, that they will not be held to account by the media or anybody else. And also the fact that every time they shout, the politicians will jump to immediately act on their most recent demands, It's just a growing confidence and brazenness that they have, that no matter what outrageous demand they make, the politicians will jump to it. And this manifested itself in several ways in the last couple of years. But If you take the most recent incidents of it, it occurred after the Belfast trial. And as you know, I mean, the men, although they were found were found innocent, the four of them were acquitted. The reaction by social media was appalling. The reaction was such that it was almost as though they should have been found guilty, that in fact they were guilty. They were held to be guilty by the mob on social media. And this again is a measure of the kind of the confidence that's there, that they don't really care what they demand anymore. They will get whatever they look for. And immediately after the Belfast trial was over, there was a social media campaign launched, and the
hashtag I believe her.
That's right. And the Justice Minister, Charlie Flanagan, less than a week after the trial was over, he announced that a review of judicial procedure, legal procedure in all sexual assault trials was being carried out. Almost immediately following that announcement, there was a report produced by the Rape Crisis Network Ireland, which set out a 50 or 60-page document calling for a whole series of changes to be made in legal procedure. It was almost as though they were waiting for the minister to announce his review. They were ready for it, and they knew it was coming.
Exactly, yeah.
They have come to expect now that anytime they make a call for anything, the minister will jump. And unfortunately, this is the truth. This is how it's been going. So we're now looking at calls for due process to be reviewed or revised. The due process, which is the foundation of the legal system in criminal trials, says that the accused person is considered to be innocent until proven guilty. And the process allows for the cross-examination of witnesses by the defence counsel. But now, the Rape Crisis Network now want what they call vulnerable witnesses to be excused from actually attending the trial at all.
Oh my God.
This is how far it's gone. I mean, this is
ludicrous.
This is how far it's gone. And this includes the complainant, because the claim was made after the Belfast trial that women weren't going to come forward to report on sexual assault if they felt that they had to undergo cross-examination.
That was their excuse to justify everything else after that.
Yes, that it was like reliving the trauma of the actual assault. Now, there are quite a few things to be said about this, but the first thing to be said about it is that who would determine whether a complainant is actually a vulnerable witness anyway?
Yeah.
According to the fundamental principle of justice, the accused person is presumed to be innocent. And it's the job of the prosecution to prove the guilt of that person. And until that is done, the person making the accusation cannot be considered to be the victim.
Exactly.
Exactly. But they're now talking about the victim ever before the trial occurs at all.
There you go. It's obvious.
There you go.
Yeah.
This is where justice is being subverted now in this state.
It's getting so bad now that people's basic human rights are being infringed upon, and if you remove that, your right to a fair trial, which is guaranteed under the Irish Constitution and European law as well, if you remove the cross-examination part, like we were just talking a minute ago about false allegations, you're making it so much easier for a woman to destroy the life of a man without having any sort of risk to herself, because women never have to serve jail time for making a false allegation. Well, very rarely. The risk level is reduced, is what I'm trying to say. If she doesn't have to be cross-examined. And another part is left out as well, that in all cases, in criminal law cases, when you have the plaintiff and the defendant, you need to have cross-examination, and that both sides get quizzed and get a hard time. And rape should be no different. I know it's a horrible crime when it's genuine, and it's horrible for the woman to relive it, but that needs to be the way it's done to keep a justice system intact.
Exactly. It has to be the way it's done, because you probably have noticed that the great virtue of our time is compassion. We're showing compassion for everybody, every victim and every alleged victim, and everybody who has been a victim of discrimination or who has been in a minority wherever. It's all about compassion now. Compassion is the overarching virtue. And it is now taking precedence over justice, as we are seeing here. The demands of justice are now being subjugated subordinated to compassion, an overarching compassion. And this is ever before the so-called person making the complainant, has ever been shown to be a victim in the first place. That's how bad the situation is right now. It's extraordinarily bad. It's unbelievable. I mean, we're living in what is fast becoming a totalitarian state.
Exactly. And it's hidden as well. It's a creeping sort of totalitarianism, and people are going along with it. There's centres like us, and there's other people, of course, but there's enough people behind it now that it's building up this momentum. And it's clearly not going to stop on its own.
No, of course not. It's not going to stop because it's in the nature of totalitarians, which the radical feminists are. I mean, they are ideologues, fundamentalist ideologues, and that they will not stop until they are confronted and stopped by force. They will not stop otherwise because it's the nature of the demand to be insatiable. They will continue inventing new demands, ever more new demands, to inflict ever greater punishments on men. This is what it's about.
Yeah, and unfortunately it's swallowed hook, line and sinker by a lot of people. Even some men call themselves feminists and a lot of women call themselves feminists. But I feel especially I'm concerned about the younger generations because you have these young, impressionable kids. They want to believe in the idea that men are the oppressors and women are the oppressed. And it's kind of I know it's gone into another issue kind of, but it's the new form of Marxism, where they're trying to create their oppressor and the oppressed class. So the oppressors are straight men and the oppressed is everyone else. And somehow they think that that's going to fix anything, but it's going to create absolute chaos. It's not going to resolve anything. It's going to destroy men, and you need men, straight men, to run a society too. People who go along with this, it seems to come from, it's more of an emotional thing. They're not being rational. It's like about emotional gratification where the open hatred for men, the misandry, as it's okay to be openly hateful towards a certain segment of the society. And if you have the state behind it, the education systems behind it, that you just have this movement that's almost like a little bit immature and irrational and childish, and it's going to cause a lot of chaos for everybody.
Yeah, it's essentially run out of control for the reasons that I've been talking about, for the fact that you have these powerful lobby groups advocating for women, the radical feminist lobby groups. You have no comparable groups for men defending the situation, for men defending men. None at all, nothing. There are no male advocacy group whatsoever. You have a media which is utterly complicit with the feminist demands, completely and subservient to them and complicit with them. And you have a political system which are too scared to say anything because they might lose their seats, So everything is conspiring to make the situation ever more difficult and to exacerbate it even more than it is. We haven't mentioned another issue at all. We'll go on talking for hours about this, but we haven't mentioned another cuckoo in the nest. That is the existence of these so-called gender studies departments in Irish universities. And gender studies and women's studies, they're virtually the same. In fact, there's no difference between them. They have exactly the same ideology. You have at least 5 of them in Irish universities at the moment. There are hundreds and hundreds of them across the Western world, in all universities in the US and in the UK, many, many hundreds of such departments. And they're all spewing out a highly ideological doctrine, and the doctrine is that women are oppressed, that they're oppressed by men, that the patriarchy is all powerful and it has to be dismantled, and that all men are complicit in the patriarchy. And it has raised victimhood to the status of saintly status,
Yeah, like a religion almost.
They're all victims,
Yeah.
It's great to be a victim because it's wonderful to feel that you're a victim because you can then make allowances for all your failings and your shortcomings in your life.
Exactly.
The reason why you didn't achieve this, that, or the other. You can say, the reason was because I was a victim. Society victimized me,
It's your get out of life card, kind of.
It's your get out card. Yes, it's a cop out. And not only is it hugely damaging to men, but it's very, very damaging to women too, because women who grow up in this claustrophobic atmosphere of I'm a victim, they're damaged for life as well.
True, very true. Great point.
Damaged for life because they never know what it is to become an adult, to act with adult freedom and adult independence, because they're continuously held back by this notion that somehow or another they're disempowered or they're victimized, or that they have control. It's an appalling state of affairs,
It's incredible, especially because another catchphrase is, empowering women and to empower women. And, when you really get into the nuts and bolts of the effect that this neo-feminism is going to have, like you said there, it's actually going to disempower women, which is the opposite of what it claims to be doing.
Exactly. It's going to disempower women, but it's going to wreak havoc on society as well. In the process, it's going to wreak havoc on men because men will be punished. Men will be criminalized, sent to jail for all kinds of frivolous and false reasons, and you will increase division between the sexes. You will increase hostility, and it will lead to a collapse, a breakdown of society eventually.
That's a great point to finish off on. Well, listen, Dave, thanks a lot for speaking to me. I know, like, my new brand, so I'm a bit of an unknown quantity, but I really enjoyed it and, absorbed a lot of knowledge from you. For the listeners, I'll just call out the website. It's mensvoicesireland.com. There's some great articles up there. And listen, thanks very much. And we should do this again sometime if there's any more developments and we can kind of go into, I know there's loads of different topics to interconnect here, but we should do it again sometime and expand on some of the issues more.
Sure, we can do that, Emmett. Yeah, I'd be happy to do that again. There's an enormous amount to talk about. So, yeah, very good.
That was my interview with David Walsh, chairman and spokesman of Men's Voices Ireland. Check out their website, mensvoicesireland.com, for more information on what they do, articles and interviews. This is Resolving Reality Radio, the podcast for Ireland's new independent media website, resolvingreality.com. You can find all the social media links there, so please like, follow, share and subscribe, or send us a message via the contact page. Thanks for listening to Resolving Reality Radio. Until next time. You are listening to Resolving Reality Radio, www.resolvingreality.com.